Good afternoon. It's wonderful to see everybody here today for today's webinar, War, What's It Good For? Helping business owner clients navigate uncertainty. I'm Randy Sadler. I'll be your host, and I'm joined by Chris Gallo, who I'll introduce here in a few slides. So we'd like to remind you, keep your computer or phone on mute unless you're asking a question. I really appreciate everybody doing that. And these are the standard disclosures that we provide with any discussion on captive insurance or any topic that we cover. And I'll send you the slides if you like, and you can read through these or have your attorney review them. Chris, tell them a little bit about yourself, and then I'll do a quick intro on myself, and we'll dive in.
Sure. Thank you, Randy. Yeah, Christopher Gallo. I just commenced a 35-year insurance regulatory career with the Connecticut Insurance Department, and I'm very happy to be with CIC Services. And when we go through this today, this one presentation, the one major lesson I learned from my career in insurance regulation was the critical importance of sustainable liquidity and cash flow in any enterprise. And basically what we'll be talking about is another black swan event in the world of finance. It is an extremely negative event or occurrence that is impossibly difficult to predict and how to prepare for such black swan event.
Very nice. Yes, so we're thrilled to have Chris on board at CIC Services, as he mentioned, being an insurance regulator with the state of Connecticut. So he definitely has a very long and distinguished track record in the insurance industry. And then I'll quickly, for some reason, these slides are not advancing. My apologies. Here we go. Let's go to my slide. It's real quick. I'm Randy Sadler, and I'll be your host today. I grew up in Tennessee. I actually went to West Point and was in the Army 5 years as a tank commander. So I do have a little bit of perspective on war and military history and global politics. So glad to have that discussion today with you and share with what it means for your clients and what it can mean for them planning for the future. I currently do live in Knoxville, Tennessee, and I have been at CIC Services 10 years. So it's a pleasure to be with you all today and discuss this really unique topic. So let's quickly give a rundown on CIC Services. We are a captive manager, which means we help businesses set up and own their own insurance companies, and we've been doing that since 2005. And if you kind of lump together what we help clients achieve, or really help your clients achieve, is to establish asset protected loss reserves, increase their profit or wealth, and this is usually by millions of dollars over time, lower or control their commercial insurance cost, and then insure uninsured or underinsured risks. COVID-19 would be a classic, but as you'll see in today's topic, there are many uninsured, underinsured risks that are going to likely become even more real in a kind of a global environment where there's war, potentially more war on the horizon. And then benefit from captive insurance company tax treatment. So all insurance companies can be taxed in a way that allows them to reserve more money. Small insurance companies are no different than large insurance companies in this regard, so it's certainly worth considering as one of the reasons for owning your own insurance company. Continuing to tell you a little bit about our firm, you may or may not know this, but in May of 21, the Supreme Court ruled in our favor 9-0 in a lawsuit we brought against the IRS for an unlawful notice that they issued called 2016-66, which created a lot of filing requirements, additional filing requirements for small insurance companies, really a form of harassment for small insurers. And then in September of 21, a district court gave us an injunction against the IRS and their unlawful notice. And then finally in March of 22, a district court vacated their notice entirely. So we're very pleased. And like I said, I'll send these slides to you. You can read about them at the links below. I'd be glad to do that. And that brings us to our topic, war, what's it good for? Well, if you know the song, Edwin Starr is probably most known for singing, absolutely nothing. However, it is a good time for business owners to take a hard look at risk management and captive insurance. And let's just think about, just over the last decade or so, just the idea of going to war, many have kind of flabbergasted by it, as if it was almost unthinkable. And yet here we are, 2022. Humankind really hasn't advanced any, it would seem. But if you think about it, during the 20th century, mankind was supposed to be more enlightened, more forward-thinking technology and advancing, and it was just supposed to be sort of a golden age, and actually more people were killed in the 20th century than all the centuries combined before that. So it should be no surprise that war is still with us, and it certainly is. So how should we think about it? Well, I was at a really good talk by a retired 4-star general, and the U.S. military strategy has typically had 5 focus areas really since the end of the Cold War, and that has been Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and terrorism. So the idea being that the military needs to be ready to contain, deal with threats from these 4 powers, and then also be able to combat global terrorism. So that's a very tall order, frankly. It's a big world, and there's a lot of risk out there. And so, and frankly, in the last 10 years, these risks have become even more complex. So if you go back through history, and just have noticed of late, whether it's the 1930s or the 1970s, we've got some eerie similarities to kind of how the world feels today. And so let's take a quick run back through those, and then fast forward to today as we think about war, but what else might be coming in the next decade. So in the 1930s, we had the Great Depression, and the rise of the Axis powers, Germany and Italy in Europe, Japan in the Pacific. And interestingly, you sort of have some similar parallels today, possibly Russia and China replacing Germany, and Japan as potentially being powers that want to grow and push their influence out further. Now, if you ever played Axis and Allies, the game, some of you may or may not have played that game. The Allies typically will win because Germany and Japan were split. This is actually a little more daunting if Russia and China were to ally each other, because in a sense they're back to back. So neither one of them would necessarily be in a 2-front war. And so the thought of the 2 of them teaming up and being the Axis of the future is quite a bit more daunting than even Germany and Japan were, which they were quite daunting. Interestingly, too, during the late 30s and into World War II, shipping interdicted. 15,000 ships approximately were sunk during the war, most of them cargo ships. It was a very dangerous time to be in the freight business, for lack of a better term. And so, if we think about that, but then take those same kind of concerns, fast forward to today, we've got some wild cards on the table above and beyond the similarities to the 30s, nuclear weapons being one. And even the use of those is unthinkable, but maybe it's not. The impact today of war on energy and food supplies. And we really do have a sharply divided USA, which brings risks of its own. Now, the 70s, we had a weakened United States coming out of the Vietnam War, and there was no doubt that in the mid to late 70s, the U.S. really had been reeling from the loss in Vietnam. But we had, very similar to today, high inflation, high gas prices, and then a pretty big black eye in the Middle East. Now, if you think about it, it was the Iran hostage crisis during the Carter administration. But the Afghanistan exit in 2022 was another just utter humiliation for the United States, and a big humiliation in the eyes of the world. And it also created, conditions under which, Russia, interestingly, they invaded Afghanistan then, and Ukraine now. So Russia seems, they're basically 2 for 2 on when we look weak, they decide to go ahead and do something. So at least in the last 50 years. But the wild cards today, and compared to say the 30s, in the 30s, China was our ally, and now, we still have friendly relations with China, but it's a little tenuous if you're really honest. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was really pretty strong during the 70s. I don't think that Russia would have invaded Europe, but then NATO's strength and resolve is questionable at best. North Korea, with nuclear weapons and the ability to reach the United States, this can't be overstated. They really do have the ability to launch a nuclear weapon and hit cities in the United States. And even one or two of those could really alter the global landscape and really just be devastating. Iran continues to work on nuclear weapons. And again, a sharply divided USA, because the United States is probably more divided politically than it's been potentially since the Civil War. And I've heard quite a few modern day commentators who believe that as well, and historians. So that fast forwards us to today as we think back through the 30s, through the 70s, and now we have war in Europe again with Russia invading Ukraine. No doubt that China continues to at least be a threat to Taiwan. We don't know where that's going to go, but nevertheless, they've really never recognized Taiwanese sovereignty. But Taiwan is very important right now in that about half of the world's chips are made in Taiwan, silicon chips. So that would be a disaster if those were to fall into Chinese hands. And that's why, and you see our Congress passing a bill to try to incentivize silicon chip production in the US. Let's go back to this idea of a sharply divided USA. It's conceivable that in the next 20, 30 years, our country may even fracture into more than one country. I hope that's not the case, but any business owner ought to be thinking that that's a possibility. And what would that look like? High gas prices today, high inflation, the Afghanistan debacle, and NATO seemingly weaker. So that is the landscape that we find ourselves in. So, war brings with it emerging risks. And, the reason that I looked at 1930 and 1970 is right now, we may not be feeling the war in Ukraine as much as, say, Europe is or other countries are, perhaps those that aren't able to get food that hasn't been shipped out of Ukraine because we're able to grow food here. But it's quite possible that we will find ourselves in a much larger war with other countries being involved, and that would have an effect on us. So emerging risks include things like nuclear, biological, chemical, NBC, and commercial insurance almost never covers NBC risk. Supply chain risk is a huge one. As I mentioned, about 15,000 ships were sunk in World War II. And as the United States is internally weakened, potentially there's a risk that our military will decline, particularly our Navy, which has made the world a safe place. And so we'll see supply chains interdicted, or much more dangerous, we'll see piracy, which used to be the norm on the high seas, frankly. And we mentioned Taiwan already, and chip shortages. And if Taiwan were to be embroiled in a war, were to be invaded, chip shortages could go on for quite a while, because I believe it takes about 10 years to build the facilities to make silicon chips. No surprise, countries like North Korea, countries like Russia, and certainly China export cyber threats. They view that as a way to disrupt their opponents. War often spawns terrorism, and so that's a very real risk that business owners are facing, and then business interruption. And so we're looking at the potential of having entire markets shut down. I mean, if you were a American businessman in the 1920s and 30s, or a businesswoman, and you sold the majority of your goods to Germany, there was a point where that business was going to be in deep trouble, right? So having an entire market cut off could be a very real risk. Having energy supplies cut off, Europe is bracing for that right now, particularly as they think about winter and how much gas they get out of Russia. And then starving populations, which often comes with business interruption as well. So the reason these risks are so important for business owners, NBC, supply chain, cyber terror, and some of the business interruption policies, many of these are not covered regularly by commercial insurance. If you try to cover them, the cost is sky high, and it's very difficult to have a strategy mapped out insurance-wise to address these types of risks. So it's really important for businesses to evaluate where they are and prepare for these risks. And here's a good start point for how to do that. First of all, look across the geography where the company does business and where it draws its supplies from, or whatever operations it's in. Assess that geography and how's that geography potentially impacted by war and the growth of war or terrorism, as we discussed. The next one, really important, suppliers. And so where are suppliers located? Are those suppliers going to face tariffs potentially and in the countries that they're coming out of? Could they be cut off in a war, and what would that look like as well? So really important to understand supply chain and what might happen if that supply chain was disrupted. As I mentioned, clients or markets. What markets is your business selling into? Are those places that could get cut off in the event of war or some other unlikely black swan event? And then we see cyber. Cyber is a very real risk. So assessing your cyber defenses and also your cyber insurance. And then doing some really healthy training of employees so that they're much more wise about the risk they're facing on the cyber front. Something we don't think about, but has been part of almost every war in our past, going from World War II back, would be rationing. And so in the event of our country being drawn into a fairly large-scale war, how would rationing affect your business? And this is particularly important in the energy space. I mean, right now, with the potential for more wars cropping up globally, this could cut off energy supplies. And that could have a pretty significant effect on businesses. So having a backup energy plan, or at least thinking through how the business is going to access energy to keep operating. People, this is always a key risk for any business. It may be more of one if we were to have a situation where National Guard is called up and a lot of your employees are in the Guard, or even a draft. We haven't had a draft, I don't think, since Vietnam, but it's quite possible that it would be reinstated in the event of a wide-scale war. You know, right now, none of the branches of the military are hitting their recruiting goals. They're all falling quite a bit short, even offering as much as $50,000 for soldiers to enlist, which is staggering. It used to be that soldiers enlisted and you didn't have to give any kind of bonus. And kind of the most I've ever seen bonus was like maybe $5,000, $10,000 to get soldiers to sign up. Now they're offering $50,000 in some cases to get soldiers to sign up. So that's a kind of a mind-blowing number, but it tells you that the military is having trouble getting recruits. And then as you evaluate and prepare for emerging risks, you know, obviously the commercial insurance that you have in place, it's important to review that and see what's covered and what's not covered. Importantly, what's not covered, because that brings us to our main topic today, which is captive insurance, and the choice to own an insurance company and be prepared for all the risks that we've covered so far. All right, so right now we'll pause very quickly and see if we've got any questions. Very good. Well, in that case, let's keep moving. So the question that brings us to is, what is a captive insurance company? And so a captive is a real insurance company, typically owned by a business or business owner, designed to insure the risks of the business. Captives have been around since the 1950s, and they're generally owned by the same economic interest as the primary company. So you'll often see business owner owns business, owns captive, or holding company perhaps owns business, owns captive, or business owns captive, as you might see in the cases of like a General Electric or a Boeing. So it's a fantastic way to self-insure and protect the business. And what do captives do? Well, a captive can replace commercial insurance. It can insure what we call enterprise risks, which are often uninsured or underinsured. It can insure warranties. It can issue bonding. It can insure employee benefits, healthcare, helping save costs. And as we advise many of our middle market clients to do, any combination of the above. So a captive can combine some of the risks you see here, spread the fixed costs of the insurance company, and make it far more affordable to own your own insurance company. In simple terms, a captive looks like this. We have a business owner or business owners. They own their business or businesses, and they own their own insurance company. And so they're able to have their insurance company issue insurance policies to the business and pay premiums and transfer risk over to the captive. So that's really kind of the simplest flow, if you will, of what a captive looks like. However, this captive insurance company almost never is going to be alone. We're normally going to backstop it somehow. And there's many ways we can do that, which we'll cover. So how do we do that? Well, one way to do that is a traditional arrangement where we have the business owner or owners, and they own the business, and they actually buy their insurance from what we call a rated and admitted fronting carrier, or a front. It issues the insurance policies. They pay premiums, transfer risk, but then the front actually reinsures all or part of that risk to the captive insurance company, pays those premiums, transfers the risk to the captive insurance company, typically owned by the owners, right? So now how do we backstop that? Well, you see here we've got a commercial reinsurance carrier behind it. So the captive is taking some of the risk, and then it's being backed by, in this case, a reinsurer. Here's just a quick example of a business that pays $3 million to a rated admitted front, which transfers $2.75 million to the captive, and it uses $0.75 million of that to buy reinsurance for really large losses, right? And just an example, pro forma, 3 million premiums paid, 250,000 paid for the fronting for them allowing you to use their rated admitted insurance paper. 750,000 goes to reinsurance. We've got some costs to run the insurance company at 150. Let's say the captive has claims of $1 million. There's still $850,000 remaining in the captive at the end of the year. So you can see how this could build year after year. In 3 years, this would add up really fast, right? 2.5 million plus or minus. Now here's what we call a reinsurance captive structure, a little different. Remember, I talked about owning a captive and then making sure it's backstopped, right? So this sort of flips the order a little bit. Here we have the business owners own the business and the captive. And so we have a commercial insurance carrier that's A+ rated and insures the policies that the business was insuring, but is willing to reinsure that some of that risk to the captive, right? So we have a business, pays premiums to an insurance carrier, which passes on part of the risk to a captive owned by the business owner or business owners. And so it's actually serving in a reinsurance role. This can be quite powerful. This is an actual example from one of our clients who was paying $700,000 a year for insurance, had no losses for 5 years, and all that money was gone. But now they're paying $700,000 to a commercial insurance company that is reinsuring half the risk to their captive, right? And so just as an example, P&L, premiums of $700, $350 paid reinsured to the captive. Let's just assume the captive paid $100,000 in claims, $40,000 to run the insurance company. leaving them an underwriting profit of $210,000. Quite powerful, right? So you do that over 5 years, they'd have over $1 million, whereas before they had nothing left because they were just buying insurance and not self-insuring any of their risks. Another way is to do what we call deductible reimbursement using a captive. So here we've got a rated admitted commercial insurance carrier if required. And the business buys some of its insurance from a captive insurance company. It's basically taking a high deductible in their commercial insurance and insuring that through a captive. And then what a lot of our clients do, and we really like this structure because of the flexibility it gives, is what we call reinsurance pooling. And so here we have business owners and their insured businesses on the left, the captive here in the middle in this diagram, and then the reinsurance pool or sharing of risk with other captives on the right. So the business pays premiums, transfers risk to the captive. It reinsures risk. It issues insurance policies to the business, and then the captive reinsures risk to a pool, or if you think about it, like a co-op. In our case, our reinsurance pool that many of our clients access has 100 captives in it. So they're able to participate in this sharing arrangement. One of the nice things about pooling is any money not paid out in claims comes back, back to the captive, right? So when you buy reinsurance, if you have no losses, it's gone. When you pool, any money not paid out in claims comes back pro rata to the captive.
Randy, I have a question for you.
Yeah, fire away.
Sometimes when clients and business owners hear about a reinsurance pool, is there a risk being associated with that reinsurance pool? Or maybe you could talk about its historically low loss ratio.
Yeah, great question. So there is a risk because you're sharing risk in a co-op with a lot of other insurance companies, right? And these are captive insurance companies that we manage. One way to think about the pool is to go into a claim. So let's just think about having a $400,000 loss that's not commercially insured. Could be triggered by a war that cuts off part of your supply chain, forces you to use a new supplier that costs more, right? But you're not able to pass that along to your clients and higher prices for them. So you have a $400,000 loss to your business. Well, what does that do? Normally it would destroy wealth. You may have to lay people off, all kinds of adverse events. However, if you own your own insurance company, that same $400,000 loss, assuming it's insured by your captive that you own, then a third-party administrator, claims administrator, verifies the loss occurs, approves the claim. Your captive insurance company writes a check to your business for $400,000. And the reinsurance pool, in this case, picks up half your loss, $200,000 of the $400,000. So it pays the captive $200,000. So what happened is your loss got addressed. You were able to reserve that money over time in a tax favored way, and then have the reinsurance pool pick up half, which is huge, 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 huge. But Chris made the point, obviously, we're on the hook for other people's losses. You are. So let's take that $200,000 risk pool loss, and let's spread that over 100 plus captives. And it's pro rata based on size, but let's just assume they're all the same size. So every captive is paying about $2,000 of the loss, right? And so historically, our pool has had a 5 to 10% loss rate. And so the benefits of owning your own insurance company, protecting yourself from those exposures, asset protecting, and then enjoying the tax favorability of the captive almost always outweighs pool losses. And so it's part of being in the insurance business. I will say that during COVID, which was a torture test, we did have a 15% loss rate in our pool. And even then, all of our clients came out ahead. Now, is it possible that the loss rate would go higher? Certainly. And with today's uncertain times, it's possible, but it's also a great benefit to have a pool standing behind you when you might have a big loss. Great question, Chris. Any other questions? Okay. Very good. So these are commonly un or underinsured losses here. And we won't go through these in great detail, but many of these are in fact triggered by war. Things like business interruption, potentially losing key employees, as we talked about. And as the world becomes more complex, kidnap, ransom certainly could be a real risk. Terrorism, which interestingly, the IRS used to attack captives and argue that terrorism wasn't really a legitimate risk, but that really is a nonsensical argument, because we see terrorism only growing in the world, and there's a wide variety of it, and certainly it goes hand in hand with war as well. Supply chain interruption, a very big one. Broad form property damage could be a real risk to insure in a captive. Nuclear, biological, chemical, certainly all of these, and interestingly, pandemic. So these are common uninsured, underinsured risks that often are not picked up in the commercial market. These are in the strategic category, being outside your control. Operational risks tend to be more in your control. You see things like cyber is one that definitely has been a bigger issue. General liability, existing deductibles. Remember, we talked about taking high deductible policies and ensuring that in a captive. So many of these can be impacted by war, and so it's really important to be ready for them. Now that brings us to taxation of captives. I mentioned earlier that one of the benefits of owning your own insurance company, provided it's a legitimate insurance company, is the ability to be taxed as an insurance company. So large insurance companies like State Farm, Allstate, or you name them, receive tax favorable treatment. They receive premiums. They're able to reserve for future losses, not pay taxes on those reserves until they need to take it as profit because they can't justify the reserves anymore. And that's taxed, and then any profits are taxed at ordinary C Corp rates. But because of the ability to receive premiums, not be taxed as they set it aside for future claims, and then invest that money, you'll notice that, if you drive into most major cities, insurance companies are the largest buildings in the skyline, right? Well, small insurance companies, and these are designed typically to benefit small mid-market companies, can make an election known as 831B. 831B has been around since 1986, and it allows them to be taxed at a 0% bracket on their underwriting profit, provided the premiums into the captive are 2.4 million or less. This is a powerful way for small, mid-sized business to accumulate the loss reserves they would need to be able to weather something like, war on a global scale and the disruption it would have to their business. So very, very important to take advantage of this if a business can. And here's just an example, a good side-by-side of two businesses. The business on the left has some standard commercial insurance. In this case, we're showing $1 million a year of risk management budget. And on the left, the business owner just chooses to pay taxes and save the money. And they have $5.9 million in 10 years. The business on the right, on the other hand, decides that they're going to insure the additional risks above and beyond the risks that they're insuring in the commercial market. They take that same $1 million a year, buy insurance from their captive, and in the same 10-year period have $10.7 million. Now remember, a lot of the risks that we talked about that could be triggered by war or could be imminent could be insured over here in the captive to prepare them for the future. So the difference really is having more insurance protection and more money. And so if you think about war, what's it good for? Absolutely nothing, but it certainly is a good time to think about protecting the business from what might be coming.
Randy, on that last point, so Randy, that last slide you talked, remember at the beginning when I talked about what I learned most in my 35-year regulatory career was the critical importance of cash flow, liquidity, and additional earnings. We saw black swan events such as the 2020 pandemic, also the 2008-2009 economic collapse. So the more money, the more cash flow and liquidity an organization, a business has, the more likely they are to survive those black swan events. And that's just an example of Randy showing you by having the same commercial coverages and additional enterprise risk coverages, you end up with more money and more protection, therefore making yourself a stronger organization.
Yeah, very powerful point. Improves liquidity. I mean, if you've got 10.7 million in your insurance company versus 5.9 million outside, the business is definitely more liquid, more prepared for, more able to flex, more able to deal with uncertainty, but then also having more insurance protection. So more insurance and more money. Very good point, Chris. All right, so what happens to money in a captive that's not paid out in claims or expenses? Well, the business owner or the business owns the captive, and you keep everything. The owner keeps everything. So you can see that that's very, very powerful. So as we think about war in Europe, potentially cascading into other areas of the world, we think about other dangers that we face, which definitely are worth paying attention to. A captive in many ways is really about survival of the business. So stronger business model, better risk management, better cost control, keeping those insurance profits, being asset protected because the insurance company is very difficult for creditors to attach to, accumulating wealth inside that insurance company, and in many cases taking advantage of the taxation of insurance companies to build up reserves for the unexpected. And as Chris alluded to, captive insurance companies are the only vehicle that we know that can give a business more insurance and more money at the same time. Usually you've got to give up something to get something, and this is one of the few exceptions. So as you think about war in Ukraine, potentially other wars, global risk like terrorism, trade interdiction, potentially a receding of the U.S. presence in the world, maybe piracy and other threats. All of these can have an effect on small, mid-sized businesses. And there's really a lot of ways to prepare, but having more insurance and more money at the same time is an extremely powerful way to prepare for the unexpected. All right, any questions? So if you'd like a copy of these slides, send Chris a note or send me a note, and we'll be glad to send a copy of slides to you. Very good. All right. Well, everybody have a fantastic weekend, and we look forward to the opportunity to work with you. Don't hesitate to reach out to Chris or myself. All right, goodbye.